Hello everyone, welcome to part 3 of the room restoration project. In this part I'll be going over plastering. For this video I wanted to make it more of a beginner's guide, as I think it's something that many don't want to do themselves and find it complicated, but I think it can be easily picked up with a few tips and tricks. All that you really need is a decent plan and a bit of perseverance. At this point I finished quite a few rooms and now find it something relaxing rather than stressful. I broke the plan up into stages so that I can keep myself organized. Stage 1 is room prep. I cleaned the room and got everything out the way. I'm throwing the carpet away in this room, so not too worried here if it gets dirty. If it was something that I wanted to protect, I would use painter's tape and polyethylene dust sheets. It's very cheap and do a great job. I remove any protrusions on the surface, things like old picture nails, light switches, electrical sockets, light fixtures. Any exposed cables I had, once those fixtures were removed, I capped it off with Wago connectors, but electrical tape would work just fine. I made sure the wall is stable, so no flexing or bits off the wall falling apart. Plaster is only as strong as the surface that it's going on, so like I mentioned in the previous video, if you have flexing plasterboard, you can use expanding foam to fix it in place. I then mesh taped anything that could potentially need a bit of extra support, like gaps between plasterboard, screws, holes, even old cracks. I was very liberal here. Tape is cheap. A 50-meter roll is a couple pounds. I used an angle bead here to give the corner strength and make it really nice and straight. Without a bead, getting a perfect corner is very hard, so I definitely recommend it. I could not get nails to go into the hard plaster, so I mesh taped it. I made sure not to tape over the ridge, as I need the ridge to be my guide. As long as the angle bead does not jiggle when pressed up against, it should be solid enough for plastering. Once I had the mesh all in place, I applied SBR over anything I wanted to plaster. SBR is a suction controller. It will seal any surface and prevent the moisture from leaving the plaster too quickly. If moisture leaves too fast, my plaster will crack and look like the Sahara Desert before I'm even finished with it. So not only will this give me a longer time to work on the plaster, but also give the plaster a fantastic surface to stick to. I really don't recommend any type of PVA. I have used PVA before and it needs multiple coats to do any sort of decent amount of suction control, but also it has a chance of making the wall slippery, which will make the plaster slide around and not be easy to work with. In my opinion, the 10 to 15 pound extra for the bottle of SBR is well worth it. A bottle gets me through about 2 to 3 rooms easily, so it's a no-brainer for me. I applied one coat and let it dry for 30 minutes until it turns from a milky finish to a clear varnish look. For stage 2, I had to get my tools ready. These are the tools I'm going to use for the whole project. 2 25-litre buckets, a hawk, a bucket trowel, a medium plastering trowel. Nothing fancy here, it's just a basic carbon steel one. I went for the 102mm by 15mm, as it's a nice middle ground between a normal trowel and a finishing trowel. A couple ladders and a scaffold beam. This just makes it easier on my legs, so I don't have to go up and down the ladder. I got myself a proper mixer for this job, but a simple mixer drill bit would work just fine, like I used for the adhesive. Just don't use it on an expensive drill, as that might ruin the motor. And lastly, a cheap sponge or brush. I haven't used my trowel in a while, so I refreshed it by grinding down the edges as if it were a knife. I used a wet concrete slab and held the trowel at an angle. If you get a brand new trowel, you will want to do this too, as to get the square edges down. It will make getting a nice finish much easier. You'll want your trowel edges to be roughly tapered and not a blunt square. This basically turns your cheap trowel into an already worked in feathered edge trowel. Now that I had my tools ready, I could start working on the bonding coat. The bonding coat is only necessary if you're filling in gaps bigger than 1 centimeter. If you have a generally even surface, you can completely skip this step. In my case, I had this large hole next to the radiator that I wanted to fill. I also wanted to give my ceiling a nice curve on the upper section. I thought about using just plaster to form the curve, but I decided against it. I think plaster can dry unevenly, and with various thicknesses, it could become an issue where a section gets very wet, where it's thicker. This can cause sliding problems when I'm applying the finish. To give myself a bit of a guideline for the width of the curve, I drew out 2 lines. I'll try and stay within them when I'm applying the bonding. I measured out half the bag of bonding coat and poured it into the bucket with the recommended ratio of water, as stated on the bag. I mixed it until it was a smooth consistency with no clumps. The bonding should feel fluffy and light, but most importantly, it should hold its shape. For the hole in the wall, I pushed the bonding in, making sure that I don't have any cavities. I tried to make the cover be level with the wall, or at least a couple millimeters below it, as to not obstruct any subsequent layers of plaster. For the ceiling curve, I did the same. Pushing in the plaster, leaving no cavities. I slid the trowel in both directions to get a good coverage. Once I had a rough shape, I used a straight edge to form the neater curve, also paying close attention to even out any high spots. This is what I was left with once I was finished. Now that my bonding coat has mostly hardened, I can start mixing up the plaster. I roughly estimated the area I wanted to cover. For the ceiling, that came to about 10 meters squared, so that is one 25 kilo bag at the recommended thickness of 2 millimeters. I filled up one bucket about halfway with water. This was my cleaning bucket, and in the other bucket I measured out the amount of liters I needed for the plaster. So the Thistle multi-finish specifies 11.5 liters per 25 kilo bag. Once I had everything ready, I poured in the powder and mixed until it was a smooth consistency. This can take a minute or two. If the mix still is very tough, I can add a bit more water. Too much water will make it runny and awkward to handle, so I'm being careful with how much I add and test its form before adding more water. To clean off the plaster from the powder mixer, I can give it a couple spins in the washing bucket. Now that I have a good mix, I can use the bucket trowel to get the plaster onto the hawk. Just enough for a couple trowels worth. To get the plaster from the hawk to the trowel, I'm angling the hawk more than the trowel. If I had the hawk flat, the plaster would just sort of slide off the trowel. So I'm using gravity to assist me here with picking it up. I can then slide the plaster onto the wall. When I'm applying the plaster, I'm looking to fill in all the gaps, sliding the trowel in both directions as to not leave any cavities. I'm not using much pressure here. The plaster should be light enough to float onto the surface. If the plaster feels gummy and sort of wrist breaking to get flat, then it needs more water in the mix. For the corner beading, I used the ridge as a guide to slide on. The bead ridge is easily paintable, so it's nothing to worry about if I see the corner shining through. If this is your first time plastering, I recommend you take it slow and not to worry about a perfect finish on the first coat. All you need to really think about is a roughly even surface with a minimal amount of low or high spots, focusing on keeping the 2 to 3 millimeter depth. Ignore working too much on the edges, as that will be pretty much filled in on the second coat and polishing stages. For the timing, plaster should stay workable for a good 30 to 40 minutes. And even then, if I still need more time, I can add more water into the mix and get another 10 to 15 minutes out of the plaster. If you're worried that you did not get the plaster flat enough, you can use a straight edge like I did with the bonding coat to even out any high spots. For these 3 stages, I did it across multiple days, so I would choose a section of the ceiling or wall, and I would do the first coat, second coat, and finishing on that particular section, and I'll basically let it dry for maybe a day or so, and then come back to the rest of the walls. In between that time, the plaster is going to dry a bit, and if you do put more plaster on it, it will start cracking. So what I did to prevent that from happening, I applied a bit of moisture before plastering against the corners that I've already done. I gave it a good couple swipes of water, and that just let any sort of wet plaster not dry up instantly the moment it touches that dry section. Obviously, if you're doing it alone, this is more realistic, but if you're doing a group or if you have a buddy, then you'll probably be able to do the whole room at once. To make sure I'm timing the second coat correctly, I wait until the plaster is touch dry. What I mean by that is if I lightly touch my fingers onto the plaster, I don't have any plaster coming off and sticking to my fingers. I can still feel it being a bit malleable. This is pretty much a good sign. The timing would depend on the thickness of the application and the suction of the wall, but with SBR, I usually find that about 60 to 70 minutes after originally mixing the plaster, it starts going off. If the plaster I had left over is still workable, I can use that for my second coat, but I don't recommend it on the larger walls, as it might become tough to keep up with as it gets harder and harder. I prefer to just throw the plaster on I did not use into an empty plaster bag and then mix up another batch. I usually go a lot thinner on the second coat. I measure out roughly half the amount I used on the base coat. In my case, that would be half the 25 kilo bag. Apart from going a bit thinner, I apply the coat the exact same way as before. Not too much pressure, making sure I get an even and sort of rough coverage. So now for the floating and polishing stage, same as before, I wait for a bit so that the second coat becomes a bit drier. This usually happens 30 to 40 minutes into the second coat as the layer is thinner. At this point, I can smooth out everything. If I feel the trowel is jittering or not sliding properly, I can use a wet sponge to float some moisture into the plaster. This makes a slight layer of fat that I can push around and fill the voids in or remove any marks. At this stage, to get a really nice surface without any marks, it's super important that I have a trowel that has been worked in. On a new trowel or one that has been rusted over, the blunt edges would be leaving loads of little marks and scuffs. So that a little bit of preparation that we did on the concrete is doing a really good job. This is the best time to fill out any gaps and imperfections in the edges. I'm really pushing in with all my weight, gathering some soft plaster and pressing it into the gaps, forming a nice uniform line. Though I try to get a good finish, it's not always to be expected. It's fine if there's some minor imperfections. Lastly, whilst the plaster is still a bit soft, I score out any slight gaps around the window frame. In the event that the wood does swell, this gap will just ensure that the plaster does not crack under pressure. This takes me into the last stage, which is drying. At this point, it's very important that we let the plaster dry out naturally. With the window open, it can take 2 to 3 weeks to see all the moisture leave. During this time, no paint or fixtures should be applied to the wall, and there really needs to be free-flowing air in and out of the room. There's around 70 litres in the room that I calculated, so patience is really needed. I don't want any moisture burning up inside the insulation and causing mold problems in the future. Once the room was all dry, this is how it looked. There are a few spots to sand down and fill in, but I will leave that for the decoration part of the series. I hope you enjoyed the video and look forward to see you in the next episode where I take on the window frame and skirting, maybe even the painting.